In the vast expanse of time, when stars wheeled through countless seasons, above an earth still finding its shape, two rivers began their eternal dance across a land that would cradle humanity's first great awakening. Here, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved their ancient channels through soil rich with possibility, the story of civilization itself would unfold like a scroll written in clay and stone. The land between the rivers stretched beneath endless skies, a realm where heaven seemed to touch earth along horizons that shimmered with heat and promise. These twin waterways flowed not merely as streams of water, but as arteries of life itself, carrying within their currents the very essence of transformation. From the snow-crowned peaks of distant mountains they gathered strength and purpose, winding through valleys and plains until they reached the warm waters of the southern sea. As the great ice that had locked the world in frozen stillness began its slow retreat, the climate of this region stirred like a sleeping giant gradually awakening. The air grew warmer with each passing season, and rains fell in patterns that nurtured rather than destroyed. Where once only hardy grasses had survived the harsh winds, now forests of oak and pistachio began to spread across the hillsides. Wild wheat and barley grew in abundance, their golden heads swaying in breezes that carried the scent of change. Into this awakening landscape came small bands of people, their eyes bright with curiosity, and their hands skilled in ways their ancestors had never imagined. They were the children of a world in transition, no longer bound to follow the great herds across endless steppes, yet not yet settled into the rhythms of permanent dwelling. These wanderers carried with them tools of flint and bone, baskets woven from reeds, and most precious of all, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had learned to read the subtle signs of season and weather. They moved slowly through this land of rivers, pausing here to gather wild grains, there to hunt the gazelles that grazed in vast herds across the fertile plains. Some stayed longer than others, building temporary shelters from the abundant reeds that grew along the riverbanks. They discovered that the soil here held moisture longer than in the drier lands they had known, and that seeds dropped accidentally would sprout and grow with surprising vigor. The rivers themselves seemed to call to these early people, offering not just water for drinking, but clay for shaping, fish for eating, and reeds for building. The annual floods, which came with such regularity that they could be anticipated and prepared for, left behind rich layers of silt that made the earth dark and fertile. It was as if the land itself was preparing for something momentous, accumulating the resources and conditions necessary for a great transformation. In the quiet moments between one day and the next, as campfires flickered along the riverbanks and stars traced their ancient patterns overhead, these people began to sense that their wandering days might be drawing to a close. The land seemed to whisper of possibilities they had never considered, of ways of living that went beyond the eternal cycle of movement and migration. The stage was being set for humanity's first great experiment in staying still, in putting down roots as deep and permanent as the rivers themselves. Beneath layers of earth that have accumulated over 10,000 years, archaeologists today uncover the humble beginnings of humanity's first permanent homes. Each carefully brushed fragment of pottery, each post hole darkened by ancient fires, tells the story of people who made a choice that would echo through all subsequent history. They chose to stay. The earliest settlements appeared like islands of human activity scattered across the landscape, modest clusters of round dwellings constructed from the materials the rivers provided in abundance. Reeds, growing tall and straight along the water's edge, were bundled and bent into frameworks, then plastered with mud mixed with chopped straw to create walls that could withstand both sun and storm. These first architects worked without blueprints, guided only by practical necessity and an intuitive understanding of how to create shelter that felt like home. Inside these early houses, families developed new rhythms of daily life. No longer did they wake each morning wondering where the day's journey might lead them. Instead, they woke to the same view through their doorways, the same patch of sky framed by familiar walls. Women ground wild grains on stone querns placed permanently in corners designated for food preparation. Men crafted tools at workbenches built into the structures themselves, creating the first specialized spaces for different activities. The seasonal rounds that had once required constant movement now could be observed from a single place. Spring brought the gathering of young shoots and the collection of bird eggs from nearby marshes. Summer meant the harvesting of wild grains that grew ever more abundant around the settled areas, almost as if the plants themselves approved of this new relationship with their human neighbors. Autumn was a time of preparation, with surplus food stored in large pottery jars that represented another revolutionary innovation. Containers too heavy and fragile for nomadic life, but perfect for people who planned to remain in one place.
Children born in these early villages knew a stability their parents had never experienced. They played in the same spots day after day, developing deep familiarity with every tree, every bend in the nearby stream, every hiding place among the reeds. This intimacy with place fostered new forms of knowledge and observation. Young people learned to read subtle changes in their environment with unprecedented precision, noticing which wild plants grew most vigorously where, which animals followed which paths through the settlement area. The social fabric of these communities grew more complex as families chose to remain neighbors season after season. Disputes that might have once been resolved by group separation now required new forms of negotiation and compromise. Shared resources like the best fishing spots or the clay deposits used for pottery needed management. Gradually, informal leaders emerged, elders whose judgment carried weight, skilled crafters whose expertise was valued, individuals who showed particular ability to mediate conflicts and coordinate group activities. Religious practices, too, began to change as people developed deeper relationships with specific places. Certain groves became sacred. Particular bends in the river took on spiritual significance, and small shrines appeared where offerings could be left for the spirits who watched over the settlement. These early religious sites were modest affairs: a circle of stones, a specially shaped tree, a spring regarded as particularly blessed. But they marked the beginning of humanity's long relationship with sacred architecture. As generations passed in these first permanent communities, the landscape itself began to bear the marks of sustained human presence. Paths worn by countless footsteps connected dwelling to dwelling. Waste areas developed where pottery shards and food scraps accumulated, and the very soil grew richer from years of human habitation. The great experiment in staying still had begun, laying foundations for transformations yet to come.
In a settlement beside the slow-moving waters of what we now call the Euphrates, a woman knelt in the morning sun, her weathered hands selecting seeds from a clay bowl with careful deliberation. She was perhaps the 1000th generation to gather wild grains, yet she was about to become something entirely new in human history, the world's first farmer. The seeds she chose that day were different from those her grandmother had collected, subtly altered by years of unconscious selection, and she was about to plant them with conscious intent. This transformation did not happen in a single moment, but unfolded slowly across centuries like a river gradually changing its course. Wild wheat and barley had grown in these regions since the ice retreated, but observant gatherers began to notice that certain plants produced larger seeds, that some varieties held their grain more tightly until harvest time, that particular patches yielded more abundantly year after year. Without understanding the principles of selective breeding, these early cultivators were guiding the evolution of their food sources through countless small choices. The first deliberate act of cultivation might have begun simply with clearing weeds around the most productive wild stands, or perhaps with scattering saved seeds near settlements where they could be easily monitored and protected. Women who had traditionally been the gatherers and thus most knowledgeable about plant behavior likely led these early experiments. They developed an intimate understanding of seed selection, soil preparation, and the timing of harvests that would provide the foundation for all subsequent agriculture. The transformation of wild animals followed similar patterns of gradual change and conscious choice. Wild aurochs, the magnificent and dangerous ancestors of cattle, began to linger near human settlements, attracted by grain scraps and the security that came from human presence. Generations passed before the bravest individuals among both species began to establish tentative relationships of mutual benefit. Young animals, orphaned or born near settlements, were sometimes raised by human families, gradually becoming less fearful and more dependent on their human caregivers. Sheep and goats proved more amenable to domestication than the mighty aurochs. Their smaller size made them easier to manage, their social nature made them comfortable in herds, and their ability to thrive on vegetation humans could not digest made them valuable companions. The first shepherds learned to read the subtle signs of animal behavior, understanding when a ewe was ready to give birth, recognizing the early symptoms of illness, developing techniques for guiding herds to the best pastures while protecting them from predators. The domestic dog, humanity's first animal partner, played a crucial role in these early experiments with herding and farming. These intelligent creatures, themselves descended from wolves that had chosen to associate with human groups, became intermediaries between the human and animal worlds. They helped guard settlements from wild predators, assisted in hunting activities, and eventually learned to help manage the growing flocks and herds that surrounded the early villages. With each successful harvest, with each healthy calf or kid born to domestic animals, the bonds between these communities and their chosen places grew stronger. The investment of labor in preparing fields, building storage facilities, and caring for animals created a commitment to place that nomadic life had never required. Families began to think not just of the current season, but of seasons yet to come, planning improvements to their fields, breeding their best animals, and saving their finest seeds for future plantings. The implications of this agricultural revolution rippled through every aspect of human life,
setting the stage for social complexities and cultural developments that would transform humanity's relationship with the world forever.
Walk with me through the streets of Uruk as they might have appeared on a warm morning 4,000 years before the birth of Christ, when this settlement had grown beyond anything the world had ever seen. The sun rises over walls of sun-dried brick that stretch further than the eye can follow, enclosing a space where perhaps 50,000 people begin their daily routines in humanity's first experiment with truly urban living. The narrow streets wind between houses pressed close together, their flat roofs forming a landscape of terraces where families dry grain, weave baskets, and escape the heat of midday. Children's laughter echoes from courtyards hidden behind blank walls, while the steady rhythm of grinding stones provides a percussion that speaks of prosperity and abundance. The air carries a complex mixture of scents: bread baking in household ovens, incense drifting from distant temples, the earthy smell of freshly worked clay, and the green fragrance of the gardens that flourish wherever water can be channeled from the nearby canals. In the potter's quarter, master craftsmen shape vessels on wheels that spin with hypnotic regularity. Their apprentices prepare clay, mixing river mud with carefully selected tempers, while the rhythmic fapping of pottery paddles against wet surfaces creates a sound like gentle rainfall. Each workshop specializes in different forms: storage jars tall as a person, delicate cups for temple ceremonies, sturdy bowls for daily meals, and the thousands of small tablets that serve the growing needs of record-keeping and communication. The weaver's district hums with different rhythms as looms clack in steady patterns, transforming wool from the city's flocks into textiles that will travel to distant lands. Women work in groups, their conversations flowing as smoothly as their threads, sharing techniques passed down through generations while innovating new patterns and dyes. The finest cloth, woven with threads of gold and silver, will adorn the bodies of gods in their temples and kings in their palaces. Moving toward the city center, the buildings grow larger and more impressive. Here live the merchants, whose trading expeditions bring exotic materials from lands weeks of travel away. Cedar wood from mountain forests, lapis lazuli from mines beyond the eastern desert, shells from seas most citizens will never see. Their houses reflect their prosperity, with spacious courtyards, elaborate decorations, and rooms dedicated to displaying the wonders they have collected from across the known world. The scribal schools occupy buildings of particular importance, for here young men from wealthy families undergo the long training necessary to master the complex art of writing. Their voices rise and fall in unison as they chant multiplication tables and memorize lists of words, preparing for careers as administrators, accountants, and keepers of the records that make urban life possible. The most gifted among them may someday compose the epic poems and religious hymns that give meaning to their civilization. At the heart of Uruk rises the great temple complex, its central ziggurat climbing toward the heavens in stepped stages that seem to bridge the gap between human dwelling and divine realm. From this sacred height, the entire city spreads below like a map made manifest. the geometric patterns of irrigated fields beyond the walls, the ribbon of the river that gives life to everything, the roads that stretch toward other cities and distant kingdoms. In the evening, as the sun sets behind the temple towers, the city settles into quieter rhythms. Families gather on rooftops to share meals and watch stars appear in the darkening sky. Night guards take their posts along the walls, their torches creating points of light that mark the boundary between the ordered world within and the vast darkness of the surrounding landscape. The sounds of the city, children being sung to sleep, adults discussing the day's work, the distant chanting from temple ceremonies, gradually fade into the peaceful breathing of a community at rest. This was Uruk at its height, a miracle of human organization and creativity, setting patterns that would be copied and adapted by cities across the world for millennia to come.
In a small room above the temple storehouses, a young man named Enlil Bani sits cross-legged on a reed mat, a lump of soft clay resting on his lap like a sleeping animal waiting to be awakened. His fingers, stained permanently brown from years of working with wet earth, hold a reed stylus cut to a precise angle. Today marks his 7th year of training in the sacred art of making marks that speak, and for the first time, his teacher has asked him to compose original words rather than merely copying the exercises of his predecessors. The journey to this moment began long before Enlil Bani was born, in the practical needs of temple administrators who struggled to track the increasing complexity of their urban economy. Originally, these early record keepers used small clay tokens, tiny sheep-shaped pieces to represent sheep, miniature jars to stand for oil, simple cones for measures of grain. These tokens were stored in sealed clay envelopes, creating the world's first filing system, a way to remember transactions and obligations across seasons and years. But as Uruk grew larger and its economy more intricate, the token system proved insufficient for the flood of information that needed to be preserved. Some unknown genius, working perhaps in frustration at the limitations of the old methods, began to press the tokens into soft clay before sealing them away, creating permanent impressions that could be read without breaking open the storage containers. From this practical innovation came the revolutionary realization that marks in clay could represent not just things, but ideas. The evolution from token impressions to true writing unfolded gradually as scribes experimented with ways to capture more complex concepts. A simple picture of a sheep could represent the animal itself, but what about abstract notions like ownership, future obligations, or the relationship between herder and flock? Slowly, systematically, the marks began to represent not just things seen, but sounds spoken. The word for sheep in the local language could be broken into its component sounds, and those sounds could be represented by marks that originally depicted entirely different objects. Enlil Bani learned this system through endless repetition, his hand moving in practiced patterns as he impressed wedge-shaped marks into tablet after tablet. Each character required precise pressure and angle. Too light, and the mark would be illegible. Too heavy, and the clay would tear. His first years were spent mastering the basic signs, learning to recognize the several hundred symbols that formed the foundation of literate communication. Mathematical calculations, lists of goods, legal contracts, and religious formulas filled his practice tablets, each one fired in kilns until it became as permanent as stone. As master scribes, these men would serve as the memory of their civilization, recording everything from royal proclamations to private letters, from astronomical observations to magical incantations. They developed specialized vocabularies for different fields of knowledge, technical terms for mathematics and engineering, precise legal language for contracts and court proceedings, elevated poetic diction for religious and literary compositions. The most skilled among them became composers in their own right, creating works that would be copied and studied for millennia. Today, as Enlil-Bani prepares to inscribe his first original text, he participates in a transformation as profound as the invention of agriculture itself. The marks he makes in clay will outlast bronze weapons and golden jewelry, preserving human thoughts and experiences for generations yet unborn, creating a bridge across time that connects his ancient world to ours.
In the hour before dawn, when the great ziggurat of Uruk stands silhouetted against stars that still hold dominion over the eastern sky, Ninshubur begins her daily communion with the sacred. As high priestess of Inanna, goddess of love and war, she moves through rituals that bind together heaven and earth, weaving the spiritual and material realms into a single fabric of divine order. Her bare feet whisper across stone floors, worn smooth by generations of devotion, each step part of a dance as old as the city itself. The temple she serves stands not merely as a house of worship, but as the beating heart of urban civilization. Within its walls, carved from blocks of limestone that gleam white in the pre-dawn darkness, the goddess dwells in her earthly form as a statue of gold and precious stone. Around this divine presence, an entire economy revolves with the precision of celestial mechanics. Warehouses stretch behind the main sanctuary, storing thousands of bushels of barley, countless jars of oil, bales of wool, and ingots of copper that represent the offerings and tithes that sustain both divine and human communities. As the first light touches the temple walls, Ninshubur performs the morning toilet of the goddess, a ceremony that transforms the care of the divine image into an act of cosmic maintenance. She bathes the golden figure with water perfumed with rare essences, dresses it in robes woven with threads of silver, and arranges before it a breakfast of bread, meat, beer, and fruits that mirrors the meals of earthly rulers. These offerings will later feed the temple staff, but for now they represent the fundamental relationship between divine and human realms, a partnership of mutual care and obligation. The economic power of the temple reveals itself as the morning progresses and administrators arrive to begin their daily calculations. Ninshubur oversees not only religious ceremonies, but the complex accounting that tracks the income from thousands of acres of temple-owned farmland, the productivity of workshops where textile workers spin and weave, the profits from trading expeditions that carry temple goods to distant cities. Scribes bent over their tablets record every transaction, their careful cuneiform creating permanent records of loans extended to farmers, wages paid to craft workers, taxes collected from merchants who trade in temple precincts. The temple functions as the city's first bank, lending seed grain to farmers at planting time, advancing raw materials to craftsmen, financing the trading ventures that bring exotic goods from lands beyond the horizon. Interest rates and repayment schedules are calculated with mathematical precision, creating a system of credit that allows economic activity to expand beyond the limits of immediate barter.
Farmers can plant larger fields, knowing they can borrow tools and seed, then repay after harvest. Artisans can undertake ambitious projects, secure in their access to materials and markets. In the afternoon, Nin Shubur receives petitioners who come seeking the goddess's intervention in their worldly affairs. A merchant whose caravan has been delayed by bandits requests divine protection for his next journey. A woman whose husband has fallen ill brings offerings of oil and bread, hoping to secure healing. A young man about to depart on his first trading expedition asks the goddess's blessing on his venture. Each request requires careful consideration, for the temple's reputation depends on the effectiveness of its intercession with the divine powers that govern human fortune. As evening approaches and lamps begin to flicker in the sanctuary, Nin Shubur prepares the goddess for the night. The evening meal is presented with the same ceremony as the morning offering. Hymns are sung to call down divine protection over the sleeping city, and the temple doors are sealed until dawn returns. Throughout the city, families rest secure in the knowledge that the goddess watches over them, that the temple's wealth provides stability in uncertain times, and that the complex web of relationships between divine and human, spiritual and material, continues to hold their world together. In serving the goddess, Nin Shubur serves her community, managing resources that support not only religious activities, but the entire foundation of urban civilization.
Long before Homer sang of Odysseus, before scribes recorded the deeds of Achilles, the people of ancient Uruk gathered in the flickering light of oil lamps to hear tales of their own hero king, Gilgamesh. In the deep hours of night, when the weight of mortality pressed most heavily on human hearts, storytellers would begin the epic that speaks to fears and longings as old as consciousness itself. The tale of a Ting who learned that even the mightiest must accept the common fate of all who draw breath. Gilgamesh ruled Uruk, in those days when the boundary between legend and history was as thin as morning mist over the marshlands. 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, he possessed strength that could topple cedar trees and passion that burned like fire in a grain storehouse. Yet for all his power, he was afflicted with the restlessness that comes to those who sense their own extraordinary nature, but find themselves trapped within ordinary limitations. His people both revered and feared him, for he demanded that they match his tireless energy and boundless ambitions. The gods, observing Gilgamesh's isolation within his own supremacy, created for him a companion unlike any other, Enkidu, a wild man who ran with gazelles and drank from streams alongside lions. Their first meeting erupted in combat that shook the foundations of buildings and cracked the earth beneath their feet. They wrestled through the streets of Uruk like forces of nature unleashed, neither able to overcome the other, until exhaustion brought them to a standstill and mutual recognition of equality. In that moment of shared defeat and shared strength, they discovered something more precious than individual power, the bond of perfect friendship. Together, these companions embarked on adventures that carried them beyond the boundaries of the civilized world. They journeyed to the great cedar forest that grew in the distant mountains where Humbaba guarded secrets older than human memory. They slew the bull of heaven, whose breath brought drought and whose hoofbeats caused earthquakes. Each victory seemed to prove that divine blood and mortal will could overcome any obstacle, that friendship could conquer even the ancient laws that bound ordinary men. But the gods, who measured justice in cosmic scales, decreed that such presumption must be answered with loss. Enkidu fell ill with a wasting disease that slowly drew the life from his powerful limbs, leaving Gilgamesh to watch helplessly as his beloved friend faded like a flame deprived of oil. For 7 days and nights, Gilgamesh refused to accept that death had claimed his companion, sitting beside the still form until decay forced him to acknowledge what his heart could not bear to accept. Grief transformed the mighty king into a wanderer, haunted by questions that permitted no rest. If death could claim Enkidu, strongest and most vital of men, what hope was there for anyone? Driven by desperation that exceeded even his earlier passions, Gilgamesh abandoned his throne and set out to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who, alone among mortals, had been granted eternal life. Through wilderness and wasteland, across waters of death and mountains of scorpion men, he pursued the impossible dream of escaping mortality. When at last he reached the distant island where Utnapishtim dwelt in timeless peace, the ancient survivor spoke words that cut deeper than any sword. Death, he explained, was woven into the very fabric of existence, as essential to life as breath itself. The gods had decreed different fates for gods and men, to the divine eternal existence, to mortals the precious brevity that gave meaning to every moment, every choice, every love. As dawn broke over the primeval waters, Gilgamesh began his long journey home to Uruk, carrying within him a wisdom harder won than any treasure. He had learned that immortality lies not in endless years, but in deeds that outlive the doer, in love that transcends death, and in the courage to live fully while accepting life's ultimate limitation.
In the vast audience hall of Sargon's palace, a young scribe named Marduk Nasir kneels on polished stone floors, his reed stylus poised above a clay tablet that will carry the emperor's words to governors in distant provinces. Around him, the evidence of unprecedented power manifests in every carved relief, every golden vessel, every exotic tribute that speaks of an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Yet 20 years ago, the man who now commands half the known world began his career as nothing more than a cupbearer in the court of Kish, a trusted servant whose greatest responsibility was ensuring that his king's wine remained untainted. The transformation of Sargon from palace attendant to world conqueror reads like a tale crafted by poets, yet it unfolded with the inexorable logic of ambition meeting opportunity. Born, according to legend, to a mother who set him adrift on the Euphrates in a basket sealed with bitumen, he was rescued and raised by a gardener who taught him to tend date palms and understand the rhythms of growing things. Perhaps this humble beginning gave him the patience to wait for the right moment to seize power, and the wisdom to nurture his conquests once they were won. From his position as cupbearer, Sargon observed the weaknesses that plagued the traditional city-state system. Each urban center jealously guarded its independence, forming temporary alliances that dissolved as quickly as they were made. Trade wars erupted over water rights and commercial privileges. Armies were raised seasonally from citizens who preferred their fields to fighting. Led by kings whose authority rarely extended beyond their own walls. In this fragmented landscape, Sargon recognized an opportunity for someone bold enough to imagine a different kind of state entirely.
When he seized control of Kish through methods history has chosen not to preserve, Sargon immediately demonstrated his revolutionary understanding of power. Rather than following the ancient custom of ruling through consensus and tradition, he created the world's first professional army, 5,400 men who ate bread at his table every day, bound to him by wages rather than temporary loyalty. These soldiers served not their native cities, but the person of the king himself, creating an instrument of conquest and control unlike anything the world had seen. The campaigns that followed reshaped the political geography of the ancient world. One by one, the great cities of Sumer fell before Sargon's disciplined forces. Umma, Lagash, Eridu, names that had inspired fear or respect for centuries now bowed before a northern king who spoke a different language and served different gods. But Sargon's genius lay not in destruction, but in transformation. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered cities, he integrated them into a unified administrative system, appointing governors from among his trusted followers while preserving local customs that did not challenge imperial authority. The daily life of Marduk Nasir reflects the complexity of this new imperial world. His morning begins with correspondence from provincial governors reporting grain harvests from territories that stretch across dozens of different languages and customs. Mesopotamian barley, Syrian timber, Anatolian metals, and Elamite crafts flow through accounting systems that require new forms of record-keeping and new concepts of standardized value. Sargon's empire functions not through the personal relationships that bound traditional city-states, but through bureaucratic efficiency that can coordinate activities across vast distances. In the palace workshops, craftsmen from a dozen different traditions work side by side, creating new forms of art that blend Sumerian religious themes with Akkadian royal ideology. Cylinder seals bear images that combine traditional symbols with innovative motifs celebrating imperial unity. Victory steels record conquests in multiple languages, ensuring that Sargon's achievements can be understood by all his subjects, regardless of their native tongue. As evening approaches, and Marduk Nasir completes his day's tablets, he participates unknowingly in humanity's first experiment with multi-ethnic empire, a system that will provide the template for Alexander, Augustus, and countless rulers yet to come.
The morning sun streams through high windows into the judgment hall of Babylon, where a merchant named Sinlekiunini awaits his turn before the royal court. In his weathered hands, he clutches a clay tablet bearing witness marks and the pressed seals of 3 neighbors who can testify to the boundary dispute that has brought him here. Around him, other petitioners shift nervously on the stone benches, their cases ranging from marriage contracts gone awry to accusations of theft, from disagreements over irrigation rights to charges of medical malpractice. What makes this scene extraordinary is not the human drama it contains, but the revolutionary principle that governs it. The idea that justice should flow not from royal whim, but from written law applied equally to all who come before the throne. King Hammurabi sits elevated on a throne carved with scenes of divine investment. But the true power in this room emanates from the great stone stele that stands beside him.
Nearly 8 feet tall and carved from black diorite, this monument bears the image of the king receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god of justice, while below stretch column after column of cuneiform text that sets forth 282 laws governing every aspect of Babylonian society. For the first time in human history, the rules by which people must live have been written down, proclaimed publicly, and made binding upon rulers as well as subjects. The case that brings Sinlekyunini before the court illustrates both the complexity of urban life and the precision with which the law code addresses it. His neighbor has diverted water from the irrigation canal that runs between their properties, claiming that ancient custom gives him the right to all water that flows past his upstream fields. Sinlekyunini argues that this interpretation violates newer practices established when the neighborhood expanded and additional families began farming the previously unused land downstream. The dispute seems simple enough, but it touches on fundamental questions about property rights, traditional versus written authority, and the obligations that neighbors owe to one another.
The royal judge, trained in the interpretation of the law code, listens carefully to both parties before consulting the relevant statutes. Law 55 addresses the responsibilities of upstream farmers toward their downstream neighbors. Law 56 covers the penalties for damaging irrigation works. Law 57 specifies the compensation owed when negligence or malice causes crop failure. Each provision reflects years of careful thought about the balance between individual rights and community welfare, between established custom and changing circumstances, between punishment that deters future violations and mercy that recognizes human frailty. The judge's decision, when it comes, satisfies neither party completely, but offers both a resolution they can accept. Sinlekyunini will receive compensation for his damaged crops, while his neighbor will be allowed to continue his water use provided he constructs a bypass channel that ensures adequate flow to the downstream fields. The penalty is proportional to the damage caused. The solution addresses the underlying problem, and both men leave the court with a clear understanding of their future obligations. This scene, multiplied dozens of times each day throughout Hammurabi's kingdom, represents a transformation as profound as the invention of agriculture or writing itself. No longer do the strong simply take what they can from the weak. No longer do local customs vary so dramatically that merchants and travelers cannot predict what behaviors will be punished or permitted. The law code creates a common framework for resolving disputes that transcend the boundaries of individual cities and tribes, establishing principles that will echo through legal systems for millennia to come. As Sinlekyunini returns to his fields, his clay tablet now bearing the court's judgment and the royal seal that makes it binding, he carries with him proof that even ordinary citizens possess rights that kings must respect. The rule of law, humanity's greatest invention for constraining arbitrary power and protecting the vulnerable, has begun its long journey through history, transforming Babylon from merely another city-state into something approaching a true civilization.
High above the sleeping city of Babylon, on the topmost platform of the great ziggurat known as Etemenenki, an aged priest named Nabu-Rimani maintains his nightly vigil with the stars. The Tower of Babel, as later peoples would call this sacred structure, rises in 7 terraced levels toward the dome of heaven, each stage painted in colors that mirror the celestial spheres: black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars. From this elevated sanctuary, closer to the gods than any other place on earth, the priest astronomers of Babylon conduct their patient dialogue with the cosmos, recording observations that will transform humanity's understanding of the heavens. Nabu-Ramani moves with the careful precision of one whose every action has been refined by decades of practice. His instruments, water clocks that measure time's passage, gnomon sticks that track the sun's path, carefully calibrated measuring rods lie arranged according to patterns as ancient as the city itself. Yet the tablets on which he records his observations contain mathematics of unprecedented sophistication, numerical systems that allow him to predict celestial events with accuracy that will not be matched for more than 1,000 years. The night's work begins as it has for countless generations, with the ritual kindling of the sacred flame that will provide just enough light for writing without interfering with the delicate task of observing stars whose brightness rivals that of distant candles. Nabu-Ramani's weathered fingers trace the familiar constellations, the Bull of Heaven, the Lion, the Scorpion, while his trained eye searches for the subtle variations that mark the difference between divine routine and divine communication. A star that appears where none should be, a planet that wanders from its expected path, the precise moment when moon or sun begins to darken in eclipse. These are the phenomena that speak of godly intentions toward the human realm below. But what sets Nabu-Ramani apart from the star watchers who came before him is his revolutionary insight that the heavens operate according to mathematical laws as precise as those governing earthly mechanics. Where earlier astronomers saw only the mysterious workings of divine will, he perceives patterns that can be expressed in numbers, cycles that repeat with clockwork regularity, variations that follow predictable rules. His tablets record not merely what happens in the sky, but when it will happen again, creating the world's first system for astronomical prediction. The mathematical tools he employs reflect centuries of accumulated wisdom. The sexagesimal system, based on units of 60, allows for calculations of extraordinary complexity. Tables of multiplication, division, and proportion enable him to work with fractions and mathematical relationships that would challenge scholars in any age. Most remarkably, he has learned to think of celestial movements not as the wanderings of individual gods, but as components in a vast machine whose operation can be understood and predicted through mathematical analysis. As the night deepens and the constellation of the Plough rises above the horizon, Nabu-Ramani focuses his attention on the planet that his people call Nergal, the god of war and death. For months, he has been tracking its movement against the background stars, noting how it sometimes seems to reverse direction in the sky, moving backward before resuming its forward progress. Earlier astronomers explained this behavior as evidence of the god's changing moods, but Nabu-Ramani suspects a more regular pattern, one that might yield to mathematical description if observed long enough. His calculations, inscribed in neat columns of cuneiform on tablets that will survive long after the ziggurat itself crumbles to dust, record not only the planet's current position, but predictions for its location months and years in the future. These ephemeres tables, as later scholars will call them, represent humanity's first successful attempt to reduce celestial complexity to mathematical law. creating a new relationship between earth and heaven based on understanding rather than mere supplication. As dawn begins to lighten the eastern sky and the night's observations draw to a close, Nabu-Rimani carefully seals his tablets in protective jars, preserving another night's contribution to humanity's growing mastery of cosmic mechanics, one precise measurement at a time.
In a workshop nestled between the temple quarter and the merchant district of Mari, master craftsman Shamash Hazir shapes destinies with his hands. Before him, on a low wooden table, lies a cylinder of lapis lazuli, deep blue as midnight sky, imported at great expense from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. Today he will transform this precious stone into a cylinder seal that will serve not merely as a mark of ownership, but as a miniature work of art that captures an entire mythology within the space of a hand's breadth. The creation of such a seal requires skills accumulated over decades of patient apprenticeship. Shamash Hazir learned his craft as a boy, beginning with simple exercises in cutting soft stones, gradually progressing to harder materials as his fingers developed the delicate strength needed to control copper tools with absolute precision. His master taught him not only the technical aspects of engraving, how to cut clean lines without shattering the stone, how to achieve different textures through variations in pressure and angle, but also the sacred responsibility of creating images that would serve as bridges between the human and divine realms. The design he carves today tells the story of the hero Etna, who flew to heaven on the back of an eagle to obtain the plant of birth that would give him an heir. Each figure must be rendered with symbolic precision that makes its identity unmistakable even when impressed into clay. The hero's beard follows conventional patterns that indicate royal status. The eagle's feathers are carved with mathematical regularity that suggest divine rather than merely natural origins. And the tree of life that grows between them bears fruit whose shape echoes the cuneiform signs for abundance and fertility. Working by the light that streams through clerestory windows high above, Shamash Hazir enters a meditative state where time seems suspended. His copper graving tool moves with microscopic precision, removing tiny fragments of stone in strokes so fine they can barely be seen individually, yet which accumulate into images of startling clarity and power. The rhythmic scraping of metal against stone creates a gentle percussion that marks the slow transformation of raw material into meaningful form. In the adjacent corner of the workshop, his eldest apprentice works with different materials to create jewelry that will adorn the wealthy women of the city. Gold wire, drawn through increasingly small holes in bronze plates until it achieves spiderweb fineness, is twisted into complex patterns that mimic the flowing forms of river plants. Silver sheets are hammered until they become thin enough to wrap around cores of bitumen, then shaped into earrings that catch and reflect lamplight with every movement of the wearer's head. The techniques these craftsmen employ represent centuries of accumulated innovation. The lost wax process allows them to create bronze figurines of extraordinary complexity, first modeling the desired form in wax, encasing it in clay, then melting out the wax and pouring in molten metal to fill the resulting void.
Granulation, the decoration of gold surfaces with minute spheres of the same metal, requires such precise control of temperature that the tiny balls fuse to the underlying surface without melting into shapelessness. Each finished piece serves multiple purposes within the complex web of social relationships that define urban civilization. A cylinder seal identifies its owner in legal documents, but also proclaims his wealth, his religious devotion, and his aesthetic sophistication. A necklace of carnelian beads separated by gold spacers speaks of the wearer's access to trade networks that span continents, while its specific design choices align her with particular deities or cultural values. As afternoon light begins to slant more steeply through the workshop windows, Shamash Hadsir holds his completed seal up to examine the clarity of each carved line. Tomorrow, when pressed into soft clay, these images will reproduce themselves in mirror image, creating permanent records of transactions, contracts, and communications. But for now, in the quiet satisfaction of work completed with skill and devotion, the seal exists as pure art, human creativity given form in imperishable stone, ready to outlast empires and speak across millennia of the hands that shaped it.
The caravan of merchant Ea-Nasir stretches like a segmented serpent across the undulating landscape east of Babylon, 60 donkeys laden with goods that represent the accumulated wealth of 3 generations. As the sun reaches its zenith above the dusty track that leads towards the Zagros Mountains and ultimately to the lands of the Indus, Ea-Nasir walks beside the lead animal, his practiced eye constantly scanning the horizon for signs of danger or opportunity. This journey, which will carry him through territories where a dozen different languages are spoken and twice as many gods are worshipped, represents more than a mere commercial venture. It is an act of cultural translation that binds the ancient world together through networks of mutual dependence and shared curiosity. The cargo his animals bear tells the story of Babylonian civilization at its height. Woolen textiles woven in patterns that encode religious symbolism, their deep blues and rich purples achieved through dyes extracted from Eurex shells gathered along distant Mediterranean shores. Cylinder seals carved from precious stones, each one a miniature masterpiece that will serve both practical and aesthetic functions in far-off cities. Bronze weapons tempered with tin that traveled from mines in the distant mountains of Anatolia, their surfaces decorated with cuneiform inscriptions invoking divine protection for their eventual users. But Ea-Nasir carries more than material goods in his carefully balanced packs. Rolled within protective reed cases are tablets bearing literary works that will introduce foreign audiences to the myths and wisdom of Mesopotamia. Portions of the Gilgamesh epic, rendered in multiple languages, mathematical treatises that demonstrate new computational techniques, astronomical observations that reveal patterns in celestial behavior. These intellectual exports represent a form of wealth that multiplies when shared rather than diminishing, creating communities of knowledge that span vast geographic distances. The route he follows has been worn smooth by centuries of similar expeditions, yet each journey brings new challenges and discoveries. At river crossings, local chieftains demand tribute that must be negotiated with careful attention to both current politics and ancient precedent. In mountain passes, weather conditions can transform familiar paths into treacherous obstacles that test both human endurance and animal strength. Most dangerous of all are the bandits who prey upon merchants, not merely for their material wealth, but for the secrets they carry, knowledge of trade routes, seasonal patterns, and the political relationships that make commerce possible. The languages Ionisir speaks reflect the cosmopolitan nature of his profession. Babylonian serves as his native tongue and the lingua franca of formal diplomacy, but survival requires fluency in Elamite for negotiations with mountain peoples, Hurrian for dealings with northern communities, and at least rudimentary knowledge of the trading dialects that have evolved at major commercial centers. Each language carries its own worldview, its own assumptions about value, time, and proper social relationships, requiring him to become something of a cultural chameleon who can adapt his approach to local customs while maintaining his own essential identity. The goods he will acquire during months of trading represent the exotic luxuries that make such difficult journeys worthwhile. Lapis lazuli from mines in Afghanistan, its deep blue color prized by temple artisans for creating divine images. Carnelian beads from Gujarat, their warm orange tones believed to possess protective powers against evil spirits. Ivory from elephants that roam regions so distant they exist more in imagination than reality for most Mesopotamians. Spices that transform ordinary meals into experiences worthy of divine banquets. Yet perhaps the most valuable cargo Ionisir will carry home consists of stories, techniques, and ideas that cannot be weighed or counted. New methods for metalworking learned from craftsmen in distant workshops. Mathematical concepts that solve problems in novel ways. Religious practices that offer fresh insights into the relationship between human and divine realms. These intangible imports will influence Babylonian culture in ways that outlast any material treasure, contributing to the continuous evolution of ideas that keeps civilization vital and growing. As evening approaches, and the caravan prepares to make camp in the shadow of ancient ruins whose builders are long forgotten, Ionisir participates unknowingly in the great dialogue between cultures that will shape the ancient world.
In the pre-dawn darkness of a military camp outside the walls of Nineveh, young Ashurbanipal adjusts the leather straps of his bronze-scaled armor, while his father, a veteran of 20 campaigns, checks each piece of equipment with the methodical precision of one who has learned that survival depends on such details. Today begins the recruit's final training before joining the most formidable military force the ancient world has ever assembled, an army that has transformed warfare from seasonal raids into systematic conquest, turning the highlands of Assyria into the foundation of an empire that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. The evolution of Assyrian military power reflects both geographic necessity and cultural innovation. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and lacking the natural defenses of river barriers or mountain ranges, the Assyrian heartland produced warriors who understood that attack often provides the best defense. Over generations, they refined techniques of siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and logistical organization that gave them decisive advantages over enemies who still fought according to traditional methods developed for defending city walls or settling disputes between neighboring communities. Ashurbanipal's training regimen illustrates the systematic approach that distinguishes professional soldiers from seasonal militia. His day begins before sunrise with physical conditioning designed to build not just strength, but endurance. The ability to march 20 miles while carrying full equipment, to fight effectively after days of minimal sleep, to maintain discipline and coordination under the chaos of battlefield conditions. Archery practice follows, using composite bows whose construction requires months of patient work, layering wood, horn, and sinew into weapons that can drive arrows through bronze armor at distances that render enemy infantry helpless before they can close for hand-to-hand combat.
The weapons and equipment that surround him represent technological innovations accumulated over centuries of constant warfare. Iron swords and spear points, harder and more durable than the bronze weapons of their enemies, are mass-produced in workshops that apply principles of standardization unknown to traditional armories. Siege engines, battering rams protected by wheeled shields, mobile towers that allow archers to shoot down into defended positions, catapults that can reduce stone walls to rubble, transform fortified cities from impregnable refuges into temporary obstacles that delay rather than prevent conquest. Perhaps most revolutionary is the Assyrian approach to military organization itself. Rather than relying on citizen soldiers who return to their farms after brief campaigns, they have created a professional army whose members serve for years at a time, developing unit cohesion and tactical sophistication impossible to achieve with temporary formations. Specialized corps, heavy infantry, light infantry, cavalry, engineers, intelligence gatherers, train for specific roles that complement each other in complex battle plans requiring precise timing and coordination. The psychological dimensions of Assyrian warfare prove as important as their technical innovations. Their reputation for ruthless treatment of enemies who resist creates a climate of fear that often produces surrender without battle. While their policies toward conquered populations, deportation, resettlement, integration into imperial administration, prevent the formation of lasting resistance movements. Cities that submit peacefully find themselves incorporated into an imperial system that offers opportunities for prosperity within a larger economic network, while those that resist face destruction so complete that their ruins serve as warnings to others who might contemplate defiance. Training in these psychological tactics forms part of Ashurbanipal's education as a future officer. He learns to read the subtle signs that indicate whether a besieged city might surrender, to understand how different ethnic groups respond to various forms of pressure, to recognize when harsh measures serve strategic purposes and when mercy might prove more effective. These lessons prepare him not just for battle, but for the complex task of governing conquered territories, whose populations must be transformed from enemies into productive subjects of the expanding empire. As the sun rises over the training ground and the day's exercises begin with the clash of bronze against bronze, Ashurbanipal prepares to join an institution that has redefined the relationship between military power and political authority in the ancient world.
In the hushed corridors beneath the royal palace of Nineveh, Chief Librarian Nabu-Zukupkenu moves among towering shelves that hold the accumulated knowledge of the civilized world. The oil lamp in his weathered hand casts flickering shadows across thousands of clay tablets arranged with the precision that befits humanity's first systematic attempt to gather, organize, and preserve all human learning within a single institution. Here, in chambers carved from living rock and sealed against the dampness that destroys written records, King Ashurnapal has assembled a collection that represents nothing less than the memory of his age, made permanent in imperishable clay. The creation of this extraordinary library reflects the final flowering of Assyrian intellectual ambition. Unlike his predecessors, who measured success primarily in terms of conquered territories and tributary peoples, Ashurnapal understood that true imperial power requires mastery over knowledge itself. He dispatched teams of scribes to every corner of his vast empire with instructions to copy or acquire every significant text in existence. Religious rituals from Babylonian temples, mathematical treatises from scholarly academies, literary works from royal archives, medical prescriptions from healing schools, astronomical observations from temple observatories.
The systematic organization that Nabu-Zukupkenu has developed transforms this vast accumulation of tablets into a functioning research institution. Each text receives a catalog number inscribed in its upper left corner, identifying not only its contents, but also its provenance, the scribe who copied it, and the date of acquisition. Related works are grouped together in specific sections, all medical texts in one area, all literary compositions in another, all administrative documents arranged by region and period. Cross-reference tablets, inscribed with nothing but catalog numbers and brief descriptions, allows scholars to locate materials on specific topics without searching through thousands of individual pieces.
The diversity of languages represented in the collection reflects the multicultural nature of the Assyrian Empire at its height. Akkadian texts predominate, written in the diplomatic language that serves for communication throughout the Near East. But substantial sections contain works in Sumerian, preserved as classical literature, much as Greek and Latin texts would be maintained in later libraries. Hittite, Hurrian, Elamite, and Ugaritic tablets preserve the wisdom traditions of peoples whose political independence has vanished, but whose intellectual contributions remain valuable. The literary treasures housed in these chambers would alone justify Ashurbanipal's reputation as a patron of learning. Here rest the most complete versions of the Gilgamesh epic, with episodes and variants collected from libraries throughout Mesopotamia. Creation myths that explain how the gods shaped the world from primordial chaos. Flood narratives that tell of humanity's near extinction and renewal. Wisdom literature that explores the relationship between divine will and human suffering, all preserved in multiple copies that ensure their transmission to future generations. But the library serves practical as well as cultural purposes. Administrative correspondence from provincial governors provides intelligence about conditions in distant territories. Legal precedents archived from centuries of court cases offer guidance for resolving complex disputes. Technical manuals describe everything from siege engine construction to irrigation system maintenance, preserving expertise that might otherwise die with its practitioners. Military intelligence reports analyze the strengths and weaknesses of neighboring kingdoms, providing strategic information for future campaigns. The scribes who work under Nabu-Zukupkenu's supervision represent the scholarly elite of their civilization. Trained from childhood in the complex art of cuneiform writing, they possess not only technical skill, but also the cultural knowledge necessary to understand and contextualize the materials they preserve. When copying texts, they occasionally add marginal comments that clarify obscure references, correct obvious errors, or note variations between different manuscript traditions. As evening approaches and Nabu-Zukupkenu completes his daily rounds through the library chambers, he extinguishes his lamp, knowing that the knowledge preserved here will outlast the political power that created it. Though he cannot foresee the fall of Nineveh or the destruction that will bury these chambers beneath rubble for millennia, he has participated in an act of cultural preservation that will eventually make the wisdom of ancient Mesopotamia accessible to civilizations yet unborn.
As the first light of dawn touches the walls of Kalhu, the great Assyrian capital, 3 lives begin their daily rhythms within the vast machinery of empire. In the agricultural districts beyond the city walls, farmer Adad Shumu Usur rises from his sleeping mat to tend fields that stretch toward horizons marked by the smoke of distant settlements. Within the artisan quarters, Shamash Shara Ukin kindles his furnace fires, preparing for another day of crafting the tools and weapons that sustain imperial power. In the bustling commercial district, merchant Nabu Apla-iddina opens his storehouses to customers whose needs reflect the complexity of life in a multicultural empire. For Adad Shumu-Usur, whose name honors the storm god who brings both fertilizing rains and destructive floods, the day begins with rituals as ancient as agriculture itself. He pours a libation of barley beer onto the earth, asking divine blessing for the work ahead, then walks the boundaries of his fields to check the irrigation channels that carry life-giving water from the distant Tigris. His farm, granted to his grandfather in recognition of military service, produces not only the grain that feeds his family, but also the surplus that fulfills his obligations to the imperial tax system. The crops he tends reflect the agricultural revolution that feeds the empire's vast population. 6-row barley, hardier and more productive than earlier varieties, provides the staple grain for bread and beer. Emmer wheat, ground into flour for the flat loaves that accompany every meal, grows in carefully tended plots, fertilized with sheep dung, and irrigated through a network of channels maintained by communal labor. Date palms, planted in groves that will produce fruit for generations, provide sweetening for food and fermented beverages, while their leaves serve countless domestic purposes.
In the city, Shamash Sharayukin faces different but equally demanding challenges. His workshop, located near the palace complex, where the sound of hammering will not disturb administrative activities, produces both everyday tools and specialized equipment for the imperial army. The iron he works represents technological advancement that gives Assyrian forces decisive advantages over enemies still dependent on bronze weapons. Smelting iron ore requires higher temperatures and more sophisticated techniques than earlier metalworking, but produces tools and weapons of unprecedented hardness and durability. His day unfolds according to rhythms dictated by the behavior of fire and metal. The furnace must be heated gradually to avoid cracking the clay construction, fed with charcoal that burns hotter and cleaner than wood, and tended constantly to maintain temperatures that will reduce iron ore to workable metal. The noise of his workshop, hammer blows against anvil, the hiss of hot metal plunged into water for tempering, the scraping of files against finished surfaces, contributes to the urban symphony that marks productive human activity. Meanwhile, Nabu Apla-iddina navigates the commercial complexities of a market economy that spans continents. His warehouse contains goods that represent the empire's vast trading networks: cedar wood from Lebanese mountains, lapis lazuli from Afghan mines, incense from Arabian deserts, textiles from workshops scattered across dozens of provinces. Each transaction requires knowledge not only of commodity values, but also of the cultural preferences and legal systems that govern different ethnic communities within the empire. The customers who visit his establishment reflect the ethnic diversity that characterizes imperial society. Aramean merchants seeking supplies for trading expeditions, Babylonian priests purchasing exotic materials for temple ceremonies, provincial officials acquiring luxury goods to demonstrate their status, craftsmen needing specialized raw materials unavailable locally. Each interaction requires linguistic flexibility and cultural sensitivity, as commercial success depends on understanding the varied customs and expectations of diverse clientele.
As evening approaches and each man completes his daily contribution to the imperial system, they participate unknowingly in an economic and social experiment that has created the largest political entity the world has yet seen. Their individual labors, multiplied across hundreds of cities and thousands of communities, generate the agricultural surplus, manufactured goods, and commercial profits that sustain an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Egyptian border.
Through the eyes of Belushazeb, a master architect from Memphis who has traveled the length of the Mediterranean to witness the greatest building project of his age, we observe the transformation of Babylon into a city whose splendor will echo through the imagination of humanity for millennia. Standing on scaffolding that rises beside the walls of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, he watches teams of workers apply glazed bricks in patterns that will create images visible from great distances, lions striding in eternal procession along the processional way, dragons and bulls adorning the gates through which kings and gods will pass in ceremonial splendor. The scale of construction that surrounds Belushazeb dwarfs even the impressive monuments of his Egyptian homeland. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar has become a city of superlatives, walls so thick that 4-horse chariots can turn around on their summits, gates decorated with glazed reliefs whose colors retain their brilliance through centuries of sun and storm, temples that rise like artificial mountains toward a heaven that seems close enough to touch. The king's vision extends beyond mere functionality to embrace aesthetic philosophy that treats the entire city as a single, coherent work of art. The famous Hanging Gardens, whose construction Belushazeb has been privileged to observe from its earliest stages, represent perhaps the most ambitious fusion of engineering skill and artistic vision ever attempted. Built to comfort Nebuchadnezzar's Median queen, who pined for the green hills of her mountain homeland, these elevated terraces create an artificial landscape that transforms the flat alluvial plain of Mesopotamia into something resembling the gardens of paradise described in ancient religious texts. The technical challenges involved in creating this wonder require innovations in hydraulic engineering that push the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. Water must be lifted from the Euphrates through a system of pumps and conduits to heights that would test modern machinery, then distributed through channels carved in stone and lined with bitumen to prevent leakage.
The weight of soil and mature trees requires foundations built from specially fired bricks and reinforced with lead plates, while drainage systems prevent the accumulation of moisture that would undermine the entire structure. Each level of the gardens displays plants carefully selected for their symbolic meaning as well as their aesthetic appeal. Cedar trees from Lebanon represent divine protection and royal authority, their aromatic wood perfuming the air with scents associated with temple ceremonies. Fruit trees from distant provinces, pomegranates from Persia, figs from Anatolia, citrus from the Mediterranean coast demonstrate the empire's far-reaching trade connections, while providing sustenance for the royal household. Flowers chosen for their colors and seasonal blooming patterns ensure that the gardens present a succession of visual experiences throughout the year. The Ishtar Gate, whose construction Belushazeb has watched progress from foundation stones to capstone, exemplifies the sophisticated glazing techniques that distinguish Babylonian architecture from the unadorned brick construction of earlier periods. The deep blue background, achieved through copper compounds fired at precisely controlled temperatures, provides a canvas for golden lions and white dragons whose bodies are built up in relief through multiple layers of differently colored glazes.
The mathematical precision required to ensure that patterns align properly across hundreds of individual bricks demands planning skills that transform construction into a form of applied geometry. Within the palace complex, Belshazzar has observed the creation of throne rooms designed to overwhelm visitors with displays of imperial wealth and power. Walls faced with panels of precious metals, floors inlaid with semi-precious stones arranged in cosmic patterns, ceilings supported by columns carved from single blocks of rare marble. Every surface displays craftsmanship that represents the highest achievement of its particular technique. The overall effect creates environments that seem designed to elevate human consciousness toward appreciation of divine majesty, made manifest in earthly form. As sunset paints the glazed surfaces of the city in colors that seem to glow from within, Belshazzar records observations that will influence architectural thinking for generations to come, participating in the creation of monuments that will be remembered as wonders, even when their political context has been forgotten.
In the sacred precincts of Esagila, Babylon's most ancient temple, High Priest Marduk Shapik-Zeri begins the preparations for Akitu, the New Year festival that will renew the cosmic order and reaffirm the king's divine mandate for another cycle of seasons. The ritual he oversees has roots reaching back through centuries of tradition. Yet each year's celebration must respond to the particular circumstances of the present moment. Military victories that require thanksgiving, natural disasters that demand expiation, political challenges that need divine resolution through ceremonial action. The 11 days of Akitu transform Babylon from a political and commercial center into a stage for cosmic drama. Beginning with the ritual humiliation of the king, who must kneel before Marduk's statue while the high priest strikes his face and forces him to declare his innocence of crimes against the divine order. The festival enacts the annual death and rebirth of royal authority. This ceremony, shocking to foreign observers who expect kings to maintain dignity at all costs, reflects the profound Babylonian understanding that even the greatest earthly power remains subordinate to divine will. As the festival progresses, Marduk Shapik-Zeri orchestrates the recitation of Enuma Elish, the creation epic that tells how Marduk defeated the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat and established cosmic order from her dismembered body. Professional reciters trained from childhood in the precise pronunciation and rhythm required for this sacred text chant the epic in sections that correspond to the festival's ritual phases. Their voices, echoing through temple halls filled with incense smoke and lamplight, transform mere words into vehicles of divine power that renew the world's foundations through each performance. The processions that carry divine statues through Babylon's streets represent more than religious pageantry. They constitute a form of urban theater that involves the entire population in cosmic renewal. Citizens line the processional way, decorated with images of lions and dragons whose glazed surfaces catch sunlight like captured fire, while priests bearing the golden images of gods create moving tableaux that bring divine presences into direct contact with human community. The statues themselves, crafted from precious metals and adorned with jewels that represent stellar constellations, serve as temporary dwelling places for divine consciousness that normally inhabits celestial realms beyond human perception. Yet even as these ancient rituals maintain their ceremonial splendor, new religious currents flow through Babylon's spiritual landscape. In modest houses throughout the city, Jewish exiles maintain traditions carried from their destroyed homeland, adapting ancient practices to their new circumstances, while preserving memories of Jerusalem's temple and David's kingdom. Their weekly gathering for prayer and study, conducted in Aramaic rather than Hebrew to accommodate community members born in Babylon, represents a revolutionary development in religious practice, worship organized around sacred text and communal discussion rather than temple sacrifice and priestly mediation. The prophet Ezekiel, whose visions have sustained Jewish hope through decades of exile, moves through these communities like a bridge between worlds, interpreting Babylonian events through Hebrew religious categories, finding divine purpose in political catastrophe, promising restoration that will vindicate faith maintained under impossible circumstances. His prophetic utterances, preserved on scrolls that will be treasured for millennia, demonstrate how religious imagination can transform defeat into spiritual victory, exile into purification, loss into preparation for greater glory. Meanwhile, in the temple schools where young priests learn the complex rituals that maintain cosmic order, master teachers struggle with questions that traditional answers no longer address satisfactorily. The rise and fall of empires, the suffering of righteous individuals, the apparent triumph of wickedness over virtue, these challenges to divine justice require theological responses that go beyond conventional wisdom. Some scholars turn toward dualistic explanations that divide cosmic authority between competing powers of good and evil, while others develop more sophisticated understandings of divine hiddenness and delayed justice. As the festival reaches its climax with the ritual marriage between Marduk and his consort, performed by actors who temporarily embody divine essences, Marduk-Shapik-Zeri oversees ceremonies that blend political theater, religious devotion, and cosmic maintenance into a unified celebration of order triumphing over chaos, ensuring that Babylon's glory will continue for another year under divine protection. In the temple school of Borsippa, where the god Nabu presides over wisdom and writing, elderly scholar Berosus leads his most advanced students through mathematical problems that would challenge minds in any age. The clay tablets spread before them contain calculations that map the movements of celestial bodies with precision that will not be exceeded for more than a millennium. Yet these computations serve purposes that blend scientific observation with religious interpretation in ways that reflect the unified worldview of their civilization. The astronomical tables that occupy much of their attention represent the culmination of centuries of patient observation. Night after night, generation after generation, priest astronomers have recorded the positions of planets against the background of fixed stars, noting patterns that repeat with mathematical regularity. Venus appears as morning star for precisely 263 days, disappears behind the sun for 8 days, then emerges as evening star for 263 days, before vanishing again for 50 days, to complete its 584-day cycle. Mars follows a more complex rhythm, requiring 780 days to return to the same position relative to the stars, while its brightness varies according to patterns that can be predicted years in advance.
Berosus guides his students through the sophisticated mathematics required to transform these observations into predictive models. Working within the sexagesimal system, inherited from their Sumerian predecessors, they manipulate fractions and perform calculations that require understanding of concepts that will not be rediscovered in other civilizations for centuries. Their ephemeris tables, predicting planetary positions months or years in the future, demonstrate mathematical astronomy at its most refined. Yet the ultimate purpose of these calculations remains the interpretation of divine will through celestial omens. The medical knowledge preserved in the school's archives reveals a similar blend of empirical observation and religious interpretation.
Students copy treatises that describe symptoms with clinical precision, the progression of fever, the appearance of skin lesions, the behavioral changes that accompany certain illnesses. Yet treatment protocols combine herbal remedies and surgical procedures with ritual purifications and incantations designed to address supernatural causes of disease. A broken bone requires both skilled setting and prayers to the healing goddess Gula, while mental illness demands both practical care and exorcism rituals that drive away demonic influences. In the philosophy of this age, questions about the nature of reality and human purpose find expression through mythological narratives rather than abstract reasoning. The dialogue between Marduk and Ea in the creation epic explores issues of cosmic justice and divine responsibility that parallel concerns addressed by Greek philosophers. Yet the Babylonian approach grounds these questions in stories about divine personalities rather than logical argumentation. The theodicy of Babylonian wisdom literature wrestles with the problem of undeserved suffering through poetic dialogue that anticipates themes later developed in the Hebrew Book of Job, demonstrating that fundamental human concerns transcend cultural boundaries. The students who study under Berosus represent the intellectual elite of their civilization, destined for careers as temple administrators, court advisors, or private scholars who will maintain and transmit the accumulated knowledge of their culture. Their curriculum encompasses not only mathematical and astronomical subjects, but also literary composition, historical chronology, and the interpretation of omens that relate earthly events to celestial phenomena. They learn to read multiple languages and scripts, enabling them to access texts from throughout the known world and to communicate with scholars from distant lands. The library that surrounds them contains works on subjects ranging from practical technology to abstract speculation. Treatises on metallurgy describe techniques for extracting metals from ores and creating alloys with desired properties. Agricultural manuals detail irrigation methods, seed selection, and crop rotation practices that maximize yields while maintaining soil fertility. Legal commentaries analyze complex cases and establish precedents for future judicial decisions. Mathematical texts explore numerical relationships and geometric principles that find applications in architecture, engineering, and commerce. As evening approaches and the day's instruction draws to a close, Berosus and his students participate in humanity's ongoing quest to understand the natural world and its relationship to human experience, preserving knowledge that will influence subsequent civilizations long after Babylon's political independence has ended.
The merchant Belu Shalim awakens on what will prove to be the last morning of Babylon as an independent kingdom, though nothing in the quiet sounds filtering through his house near the Zababa Gate suggests that this day will differ from countless others. The familiar calls of vendors setting up their stalls, the grinding of millstones preparing grain for the day's bread, the splash of water carriers filling their jars at neighborhood wells, all speak of a city confident in its ancient strength and eternal endurance.
Yet beyond the massive walls that have protected Babylon for centuries, the forces of Cyrus the Persian have completed preparations for a conquest that will transform the political landscape of the ancient world without spilling a drop of blood within the sacred precincts. The approach of the Persian army represents the culmination of tensions that have been building throughout the reign of Nabonidus, Babylon's last native king. His prolonged absence from the capital, his apparent neglect of traditional religious ceremonies, and his controversial elevation of the moon god Sin above Marduk have alienated the powerful priesthood and disturbed citizens who interpret such innovations as dangerous departures from the customs that ensure divine protection. When Persian agents spread word that Cyrus comes not as a conqueror, but as a liberator chosen by Marduk himself to restore proper worship, many Babylonians find this message more appealing than continued rule under a king who seems indifferent to their religious concerns. Belushalim's household reflects the cosmopolitan character that makes Babylon's surrender comprehensible rather than shameful. His wife, Zababa Eresh, descended from a family of Judean exiles who arrived during Nebuchadnezzar's deportations 70 years earlier. His business partner, Mushazib Marduk, belongs to an Aramean clan that settled in Babylon during the commercial expansion of the previous century. His chief scribe traces his ancestry to Assyrian refugees who found sanctuary in the city after Nineveh's destruction. For such families, political loyalty flows less toward specific dynasties than toward the urban institutions and commercial networks that sustain their daily lives. The actual transfer of power, when it comes, unfolds with almost anticlimactic smoothness. Cyrus enters Babylon not as a foreign invader, but as a new king participating in traditional ceremonies of accession.
He pays homage to Marduk in the ancient temple of Esagila. He confirms existing privileges for temple personnel, and he issues proclamations emphasizing his role as protector rather than destroyer of local customs. Most remarkably, he reverses the deportation policies of previous Mesopotamian rulers, allowing displaced populations throughout his growing empire to return to their ancestral homes and rebuild their traditional sanctuaries. For the Jewish community in Babylon, this policy produces effects that will resonate through religious history. Families that have maintained their identity through decades of exile suddenly face the possibility of return to Jerusalem and the reconstruction of the temple destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Some, particularly older community members who retained vivid memories of their homeland, begin immediate preparations for the journey westward. Others, especially those born in Babylon who know Judea only through stories and songs, choose to remain in the city that has become their home, contributing to the Persian administration while maintaining their distinct religious and cultural identity. The transition affects different social groups in varied ways. For the priestly families who maintain the ancient temples, Persian rule promises continuity of religious practices, combined with imperial protection and patronage. Cyrus demonstrates his respect for local traditions by financing temple renovations and confirming hereditary privileges that might have been threatened under a native king seeking to reduce clerical power. Merchants benefit from integration into a vast imperial trade network that extends from India to the Mediterranean, while craftsmen find new markets for their skills in Persian capitals under construction throughout the empire. As evening approaches on this day of transformation, Bel-Wushalim walks through streets that look identical to those of the previous morning,
yet which exists now within a political framework that spans continents. The sounds are the same: children playing in courtyards, merchants negotiating prices, temple personnel conducting evening rituals. But these familiar activities now take place within the context of the world's largest empire, governed by principles of cultural tolerance and administrative efficiency that represent revolutionary departures from traditional Near Eastern imperial practice. The Persian conquest of Babylon marks more than a change of rulers. It signals the beginning of a new era in human political organization, one that will influence governance models for millennia to come. For a civilization that has known independence for more than 1,000 years, this transition into imperial periphery might seem like decline, yet it ensures the preservation and transmission of Mesopotamian culture to civilizations yet unborn.
In the newly founded city of Seleucia on the Tigris, Greek philosopher Apollodorus of Athens walks through streets laid out according to principles that would have been familiar to Hippodamus of Miletus, yet populated by peoples whose ancestors built the world's first cities 3 millennia before his own homeland emerged from barbarism. The geometric precision of the urban plan, straight roads intersecting at right angles, residential districts organized around central agoras, public buildings distributed according to mathematical ratios, imposes Hellenic concepts of order upon a landscape where the ancient rhythms of Mesopotamian civilization continue beneath the surface of imperial innovation. Apollodorus has come to this new metropolis not as a conqueror, but as a student, drawn by reports that the local temples preserve astronomical knowledge and mathematical techniques unknown to Greek scholarship. His correspondence with the Lyceum in Athens describes encounters with Babylonian priest astronomers whose predictive models surpass anything achieved by his philosophical predecessors, yet whose theoretical framework remains embedded within religious cosmology that his rational training finds difficult to comprehend. The challenge of translating between worldviews separated by fundamental assumptions about the relationship between divine and natural causation occupies much of his intellectual energy. The temple library of Borsippa, where he spends his mornings studying with master scholar Seleucus the Chaldean, contains materials that illuminate the deep history of human thought about cosmic order. Tablets inscribed with mathematical astronomy dating back centuries reveal sophisticated methods for calculating planetary positions that anticipate techniques later developed in Greek centers of learning. Yet these scientific achievements emerged from ritual contexts where astronomical knowledge served primarily to interpret divine messages rather than to understand natural law as an autonomous domain subject to rational analysis. The cultural synthesis that emerges from such encounters produces new forms of knowledge that neither tradition could have achieved independently. Apollodorus learns to appreciate the empirical precision of Babylonian observational methods, while his Chaldean colleagues began to explore the theoretical implications of treating celestial mechanics as manifestations of universal mathematical principles. The resulting hybrid approaches will influence both Greek natural philosophy and Oriental wisdom traditions, creating intellectual networks that span the known world. In the commercial districts of the city, similar processes of cultural fusion unfold through daily interactions between peoples whose ancestors might have regarded each other as barbarians.
Greek merchants learned to navigate complex credit arrangements, developed by Babylonian banking houses over centuries of commercial evolution, while traditional trading families adapt their practices to accommodate new forms of currency and accounting systems imported for Mediterranean markets. The lingua franca that develops in these cosmopolitan environments blends Greek vocabulary with Aramaic grammar and Persian administrative terminology,
creating a practical medium for communication that transcends ethnic boundaries. Religious syncretism presents more complex challenges, as theological concepts embedded within different linguistic and cultural systems resist easy translation. Apollodorus observes ceremonies at the Temple of Bel where traditional Mesopotamian rituals incorporate new elements derived from Greek mystery religions, while Greek settlers adapt their own cultic practices to accommodate local customs regarding sacred space and seasonal festivals. The resulting religious landscape defies simple categorization, featuring temples that serve multiple divine patrons whose mythologies have been creatively harmonized rather than merely juxtaposed. The intellectual elite of this Hellenistic world moves freely between cultural traditions that previous generations would have considered mutually exclusive. Court officials trained in Greek rhetorical techniques compose official documents according to Persian administrative formats, while incorporating legal concepts derived from Babylonian jurisprudence. Physicians combine Greek theoretical approaches to human anatomy with traditional Mesopotamian diagnostic methods and Egyptian surgical procedures, creating medical practices that draw upon the accumulated knowledge of multiple civilizations. Yet beneath these surface adaptations, deeper currents of cultural continuity maintain connections to the ancient past. In neighborhoods where Aramaic remains the language of daily communication, grandmothers tell children stories that preserve mythological themes traceable to Sumerian literature, while local festivals continue to mark seasonal transitions according to agricultural calendars developed during the earliest phases of urban civilization. The ziggurat of Babylon, though partially dismantled for building materials, still dominates the skyline as a reminder of religious traditions that predate Alexander's conquests by millennia. As evening approaches and Apollodorus returns to his quarters in the Greek sector of the city, he carries with him scrolls containing astronomical observations that will eventually influence the work of Hipparchus and Ptolemy, while his Babylonian colleagues preserve copies of Greek philosophical texts that will be translated into Syriac and Arabic centuries later. These quiet acts of intellectual transmission ensure that the accumulated wisdom of both traditions will survive the political transformations that repeatedly reshape the ancient world, creating lasting bridges between East and West that transcend the boundaries of particular empires.
In a small chamber beneath the ruins of what was once the great temple of Marduk, the elderly scribe, Nabu Ahe-Eden, shapes what he knows will be among the final cuneiform tablets ever created by human hands. The oil lamp beside him flickers against walls where the painted images of ancient gods have faded to ghostly shadows, while outside, the sounds of a city in decline filter through cracks in masonry that has stood for centuries but will not survive many more seasons of neglect and decay. His fingers, gnarled with age and stained permanently brown from a lifetime of working with clay, move with practiced precision as he inscribes an astronomical text whose calculations will outlive the civilization that created them. The transformation of Babylon from imperial capital to provincial backwater has unfolded across generations with the inexorable slowness of geological change. The great walls that once inspired awe in foreign visitors now serve primarily as sources of building stone for merchants who construct humbler dwellings from the recycled grandeur of earlier ages. The hanging gardens, if they ever existed beyond the imagination of distant chroniclers, have long since succumbed to the practical difficulties of maintaining complex irrigation systems without royal patronage. Even the famous ziggurat has been reduced to a truncated ruin whose upper levels were dismantled to provide materials for more immediate construction projects. Yet in scriptoria scattered throughout the city, a small community of scholars continues the intellectual traditions that have defined Mesopotamian civilization for 3 millennia. Nabu Ahe-Eden belongs to a hereditary guild of temple scribes whose families have maintained cuneiform literacy through the centuries of political upheaval that followed Alexander's conquest, the Parthian occupation, and the gradual decline of urban institutions that once supported sophisticated scholarly activity. Their numbers diminish with each passing generation as practical considerations force young men toward professions that offer more reliable income than the preservation of ancient learning. The texts he copies represent the distillation of humanity's first systematic attempt to understand the natural world through mathematical analysis. Astronomical ephemeris tables that predict planetary positions with accuracy that will not be matched again until the Renaissance. Mathematical treatises that explore numerical relationships discovered by scholars whose names are no longer remembered. Medical compilations that preserve diagnostic techniques developed through centuries of clinical observation. All this knowledge exists now primarily on clay tablets stored in underground chambers where dampness and time waged their patient war against human memory.
The decline of cuneiform writing reflects broader changes in the cultural landscape of the ancient Near East. Aramaic has become the practical language of commerce and administration, written in alphabetic scripts that require far less training to master than the complex system of wedge-shaped marks that Nabu Ahe-Eden learned as a child. Greek serves the needs of philosophical and scientific discourse among educated elites, while Latin increasingly dominates legal and military communications as Roman influence expands eastward. The ancient writing system that once recorded the first law codes and literary epics gradually retreats into specialized religious contexts where tradition matters more than practical utility. In the Jewish communities that have flourished in Babylon since the Persian period, a different form of textual preservation ensures that some aspects of Mesopotamian intellectual culture will survive in transformed form. The schools where rabbis compiled the Babylonian Talmud incorporate legal reasoning methods, astronomical knowledge, and mathematical techniques derived from local scholarly traditions, weaving these elements into religious discussions that will be studied for millennia. Their work represents a form of cultural translation that preserves ancient wisdom within new linguistic and theological frameworks, ensuring continuity despite political discontinuity. The religious landscape itself reflects similar processes of transformation and preservation. The ancient temples still function, though with reduced staffs and simplified rituals that accommodate shrinking budgets and dwindling congregations. New religious movements, Christianity, Manichaeism, various forms of Gnostic thought, compete for adherence among populations whose ancestors worshipped Marduk and Ishtar. Yet even these innovative traditions incorporate mythological themes, ethical concepts, and ritual patterns that echo practices traceable to the earliest periods of urban civilization. As night deepens around his underground chamber, and Nabu Ahe-Eden completes his copying work, he performs a small ritual that connects him to scribes who worked in this same city when Hammurabi ruled and Babylon was merely one power among many. He smooths the surface of his finished tablet, checks the clarity of each cuneiform sign, and stores the completed work in a jar sealed with bitumen against the destructive effects of moisture. Though he cannot know it, this tablet will survive in its clay jar for nearly 2 millennia, waiting for modern archaeologists to decipher its contents and restore its ancient knowledge to human consciousness. Beneath the shifting sands of the Iraqi desert, where wind-carved tells rise like sleeping giants above the flat expanse of the alluvial plain, archaeologist Sarah Mitchell brushes soil from a cuneiform tablet that has waited 4,000 years to speak again. The late afternoon sun slants through the entrance of the excavation tent where she works, illuminating wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay by hands that shaped the very foundations of human civilization. Each careful stroke of her conservation brush reveals symbols that once recorded the daily concerns of people whose lives seem simultaneously distant and familiar. Contracts for the sale of barley, letters between family members, mathematical exercises that demonstrate abstract thinking, prayers to gods whose names echo faintly in the mythologies of later cultures. The tablet she holds contains a mathematical problem about the area of an irregular field, solved using techniques that anticipate principles later developed by Greek geometers. Yet it was created by a scribe who also believed that eclipses resulted from celestial demons devouring the sun or moon, who performed rituals to ensure successful harvests, who lived within a worldview that made no sharp distinction between natural and supernatural causation. This apparent contradiction illuminates a profound truth about human intellectual development, that scientific insight can emerge from religious contexts, that rational analysis coexists with mythological thinking, that progress occurs through accumulation rather than replacement of earlier understanding. The legacy of ancient Mesopotamia permeates modern civilization in ways both obvious and hidden. Every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes or measure angles in degrees based on multiples of 60, we employ mathematical conventions established by Sumerian administrators 4 millennia ago. Legal systems around the world preserve principles first articulated in the Code of Hammurabi, that laws should be written down, publicly proclaimed, and applied consistently regardless of the judge's personal preferences. The very concept of civilization itself, understood as urban life supported by agricultural surplus and organized through complex institutions, emerged from experiments conducted in the cities of ancient Sumer. Yet the deeper influence of Mesopotamian culture extends beyond specific techniques or institutional forms to encompass fundamental assumptions about human existence that continue to shape our understanding of life's meaning and purpose. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores themes that remain central to literature and philosophy: friendship and loss, the search for immortality, the necessity of accepting human limitations, the relationship between individual desire and social responsibility. These concerns transcend particular historical moments to address questions that each generation must confront anew, ensuring that ancient stories remain relevant to contemporary readers. Religious traditions that claim millions of adherents preserve narratives whose roots extend back to Mesopotamian mythology. The flood story that appears in Genesis bears striking similarities to accounts found in Sumerian and Babylonian literature, suggesting either direct influence or parallel development of themes that address universal human experiences of catastrophe and renewal. Creation myths that describe divine beings shaping order from primordial chaos, moral teachings that emphasize justice and compassion for the vulnerable, eschatological visions that promise ultimate meaning despite immediate suffering. All these elements appear first in cuneiform texts that preserve humanity's earliest systematic attempts to understand its place in the cosmic order.
The technological achievements of ancient Mesopotamia provided foundations for innovations that transformed human capabilities across subsequent millennia. Irrigation systems developed along the Tigris and Euphrates demonstrated techniques for managing water resources that remain relevant in arid regions throughout the world. Metallurgical knowledge, accumulated through centuries of experimentation with copper, bronze, and iron, created industrial processes that evolved eventually into modern manufacturing. Architectural principles developed for temple and palace construction influenced building traditions that spread across the ancient world and continue to inform contemporary design. Perhaps most significantly, Mesopotamian civilization demonstrated humanity's capacity for cumulative cultural achievement, the ability to preserve knowledge across generations, to build upon earlier discoveries, to create institutions that outlast individual lifespans. The Library of Ashurbanipal, the Law Code of Hammurabi, the astronomical observations recorded in countless cuneiform tablets all represent attempts to create permanence within the flux of historical change. Though the political systems that sponsored these projects eventually collapsed, the knowledge they preserved survived to influence later civilizations in ways their creators could never have anticipated. Modern archaeological recovery of ancient Mesopotamian culture illustrates the paradoxical relationship between preservation and loss that characterizes all human cultural transmission. Tablets buried beneath destroyed cities survive better than monuments exposed to weather and human interference, while languages considered dead for centuries can be deciphered through patient scholarly work that reconstructs grammar and vocabulary from fragmentary evidence. The process of rediscovering these ancient voices reminds us that cultural continuity operates through complex networks of influence that connect past and present in ways that transcend simple linear progression. As Sarah Mitchell carefully wraps the tablet for transport to the conservation laboratory, she participates in a dialogue across time that connects her work to that of the anonymous scribe who first pressed these marks into clay. The mathematical knowledge he recorded will be translated, analyzed, and incorporated into histories of human intellectual development, while the tablet itself will be preserved in climate-controlled storage that ensures its survival for future generations of researchers. This quiet act of preservation and interpretation exemplifies the ongoing human project of maintaining connection with our deepest cultural roots while adapting ancient wisdom to contemporary needs. The story of ancient Mesopotamia thus continues not as a concluded historical episode, but as a living influence that shapes our present understanding of human possibility and responsibility. In every written law, every urban planning project, every scientific investigation, every literary exploration of mortality and meaning, we encounter echoes of insights first developed in the land between the rivers, ensuring that the legacy of humanity's first civilization remains eternally present in the continuing human story.